I just wanted folks to know they can send them during the talk. That way they won't forget them. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Repkevian, who's our Executive Director. The Bar Harbor Historical Society operates the La Rochelle Mansion and Museum on 127 West Street in Bar Harbor. It's a wonderful Victorian resource where we have all the treasures and keepsakes of the town of Bar Harbor. It's a rich history and that of Acadia National Park. And you can certainly find out more by visiting our website, barharborhistorical.org. So without any other ado, Carolyn, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Richard Powers for helping us do our very first virtual program at the museum. So thank you. Just a little bit about Richard. I actually met him 30 years ago. I took a dance workshop that he led with my husband, David, and lost touch with him for a while, but heard him speak about a month ago and was completely charmed by this topic. So let me tell you briefly about him and then we'll get started. In his early career as a chief engineer, Richard Powers served big name clients around the US and holds patents for 8 common household products, but then he discovered the world of dance. He's a full-time dance instructor at Stanford University, and in his research, he has specialized in 19th century and ragtime era dances. He's choreographed dances in film, television, and on Broadway, and has led workshops all over the world. In his study of vintage dance, he has researched history, music, art, dance, of course, and as it turns out, cocktails. So now join me in welcoming Richard Powers to tell us more about the history of mixed drinks and more.
Thank you, Carolyn. All right, well, hello again, everyone. It's cocktail hour. So I was given an hour for this talk, so I will try to keep you awake and entertained with lots of variety and almost 500 photos and illustrations. So get comfortable, maybe make a cocktail and enjoy this story. Let me share my images with you. That should work. Is that working? All right. My particular interest is in historical cocktails, as you heard, and my talk will include some especially fun or beautiful cocktail books and a tale of a wild cocktail party and Prohibition and the Roaring '20s up to date. I have a recommendation for your viewing. If you're not already a cocktail aficionado and my initial background history seems a little dry to you, stick around and be patient. The fun stories begin in 10 minutes. But they will make more sense if you know where cocktails came from and about the early years. So let's go back to the beginning, even farther than that. Distilling goes back centuries, but pure distilled spirits are too strong and fiery for most people. So in the evolution of mixed drinks, did you know that the predecessor to cocktails was punch? Sailors and traders brought it back to England from India in the 17th century. Now the name punch might be from this Hindi word, punch, meaning 5. For the 5 ingredients: alcohol, usually brandy or wine back then, sugar, lemon, water, and spices. Punch was served in large bowls, as you know, and became very popular in England. This painting by Hogarth indicates why it was so popular. Punch then spread to the American colonies and was modified to use rum, which was easier to make here. And yes, it was made here. Not many people know that the manufacture and export of rum was colonial New England's largest and most prosperous industry in the 17th and 18th centuries. But Americans didn't always want to make such a large batch of punch. So next came the sling. The sling was a single-serving version of punch, but simplified to just 3 of those 5 ingredients: a spirit, rum, brandy, gin, or whiskey, and water and sugar. No citrus or spices. And that is almost a cocktail. So when was the very first description of a cocktail? Here it is. American, of course. The Balance and Columbian Repository out of Hudson, New York, was a political newsletter when Thomas Jefferson was president. The May 6, 1806 issue made this criticism of a political opponent, implying that he was a drunkard, mentioning rum grogs, brandy ditto, brandy grogs, gin slings, glasses of bitters, and the cocktail, hyphenated, 2 words. That was the earliest mention of the word, but it's not yet a description. Fortunately, a subscriber asked what a cocktail was, and in the May 13th issue, 1 week later, the editor, Harry Croswell, replied. Now, normally in a talk like this, like PowerPoint, I would not read a quote that you can easily read yourself there, but I know that some of you are watching this on a phone or a small screen. So if you don't mind, for them, I'll take the time to read all of the quotations this hour. As I make a point never to publish anything but what I can explain, I shall not hesitate to gratify the curiosity of my inquisitive correspondent. Cocktail, then, is a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. It is vulgarly called a bittered sling, and is supposed to be an excellent electioneering potion, inasmuch as it renders the heart stout and bold at the same time that it fuddles the head. We now know what a sling is, so Croswell was right. A bittered sling, or cocktail, was a sling with bitters. Did you know that bitters were a medicinal potion back then, added, it's believed, to help prevent a hangover? Next, what is the origin of the word cocktail? I'm asked that all the time. The great H.L. Mencken investigated that question in 1946, and he found 40 possible and equally likely origin stories for the word cocktail. I'll only mention a few of them. We know the term cocktail existed in 18th century America, but not yet as a drink. Racehorses, who were not thoroughbreds, had their tails docked or cocked, and were sometimes called cocktails. Noting that the early definition of a cocktail drink was sweetened and watered down, this origin story speculates that it was called a cocktail because the drink was not a thoroughbred, not the real thing compared to straight whiskey. 39 more word origin stories to go, but I'll quickly dismiss just one more, the well-known story that says the cocktail was named by Betsy Flanagan during the Revolutionary War. I won't retell that long story, which involved rooster feathers, because it turns out that Betsy Flanagan never existed. She was a fictional character in a James Fenimore Cooper novel, The Spy. 38 more theories to go, including the French word for an egg cup, coquetier, in which early cocktails might have been made in New Orleans, mispronounced as cocktail. So, in case anyone asks, the correct answer is that we don't know. No one back in 1800 recorded why it was called a cocktail. So all we have is lots of creative speculation. So let's move on. The new cocktail started to become newsworthy in the early 1800s. So we have the beginnings of a recorded history, including the first cocktail bartenders. The first famous American bartender was Cato Alexander. He was born a slave and worked at an inn in New York, where he frequently waited on George Washington. He gained his freedom in 1799 with the New York Act for the Abolition of Slavery, and he opened his own tavern. Here it is, naming it after himself, Cato's Tavern. Can you see? It's in the countryside, 4 miles north of New York City. You might be amused to see where that countryside is today. There it is, red, Midtown Manhattan. Cato was famous for his gin cocktails and brandy juleps. One New York newspaper wrote in 1835, "Who has not heard of Cato Alexander? Not to know Cato's is not to know the world." Next, born 12 years later, Orsimus Willard was the next cocktail celebrity. He didn't like the name Orsimus, so he only went by the name Willard. He worked his way up from office boy to bartender at America's finest hotel, the City Hotel in New York. Willard became even more famous than Cato, known in Europe as well as in the States. He introduced the mint julep to the East Coast and was valued so highly that the hotel's manager, Chester Jennings, made him a partner in the business. His was the first big financial success story, but then wealth would become fairly typical among the early bartenders. But they weren't all men. Martha King, also a New Yorker, was raised in the business, as her father owned a porterhouse on Wall Street, just a block from the City Hotel. When she married the Irishman William Niblo, the two of them opened Niblo's Garden on Broadway in the 1820s. As you can see, it was a woodsy suburb. Today, that woodsy suburb is Soho, the red dot. Martha knew what each patron preferred, and a British traveler wrote, quote, "A sherry cobbler from her dainty hand was something especially inviting, and created an involuntary delight for that seductive and not altogether innocent beverage," close quote. So can you see what Martha pioneered? Service, which was as important to her as what was in the drink, if not more so. Paying special attention to each customer and knowing what they prefer would become essential to a great bartender, whether a man or a woman. This is Ada Coleman, a century later, and we'll see her again. Finally, for now, Peter Bent Brigham, and you know that name if you're from Boston, was born in Vermont and was in Boston by the 1820s. He opened a bar in the concert hall building in the very heart of downtown Boston. He became wealthy enough from bartending to buy the concert hall building. So what did he pioneer? Brigham was the first to create a cocktail menu with new and fanciful innovations. After years of only basic cocktails, slings, and juleps, now there was the Stonewall, the Tip and Tide, the Fiscal Agent, the Smasher, the Wormwood Floater. That price you see on the top of 12.5 cents, that was $3 in today's money, back before cocktails became overpriced. If I may digress for a second here, I see that a lot of you here are historians. So for anyone who is wondering about my research and these images you'll be seeing, it wasn't just for my talk now, but because I wanted to know the history from the original sources if I could. For instance, I read that Brigham created the first cocktail list, but I wanted to find it and see what was on it. So after much searching, I finally found a report in the December 1842 Journal of the American Temperance Union. You know what temperance was. Where one of their anti-alcohol members visited Brigham's saloon and wrote down the drink list with the prices. So back to the story. If Brigham looks wealthy in this photo, yes, he made a fortune, which he left to a women's hospital, now the Brigham's Hospital in Boston. Each of the first 4 notable bartenders pioneered a different aspect of the art of the bar, as you can see. And note that all of them began in the Regency era, back when John Quincy Adams was president. While we're still back in the Regency era, I'd like to put cocktails in an international context. Here is a typical British opinion of America in 1820, quoting from this report. "In the 4 quarters of the globe, who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at an American picture or statue? What does the world yet owe to American physicians or surgeons?" And it continues down the page, who wears an American coat or gowns or sleeps in American blankets. English travelers Charles Dickens and Francis Trollope made similar remarks about Americans when they toured the US back then, adding that America offered nothing new to the world's cuisine. That opinion would soon change. In fact, the cocktail would become America's first culinary contribution that Europe adopted. But we're still in 1820 when we see the next major development in the American cocktail. Can you see what this is? Yes, ice harvesting. Before the 19th century, ice in the summer was a rare luxury for the wealthy. Then a new industry grew of cutting ice from lakes in the winter, storing it in large insulated ice houses, and delivering it throughout the summer, making ice available year-round, affordably. People could now enjoy chilled cocktails and have their ice in their drinks. Ice harvesting began in New England and then spread to Europe, especially Norway, which supplied ice to Western Europe. So the popularity of cocktails continued to spread in America from bartender to bartender. Jerry Thomas was the first national celebrity, you could say. He began in San Francisco in 1849 during the 49ers gold rush, became a bit renowned. Then he moved to New York and to many other cities. Thomas was known for his showmanship as a bartender. He called himself the professor and developed elaborate and flashy techniques of mixing cocktails, sometimes while juggling bottles and cups. And that was copied by others across the country. I mention him because Jerry Thomas wrote the very first cocktail book in 1862, The Bartender's Guide. Among his 500 drink recipes were 10 cocktails, there on the left, just a few of them. All 10 had bitters, bittered slings. So that was the original definition of a cocktail. Generations later, the word cocktail would come to mean any kind of a mixed drink, but not yet. Now, only 9 years after Jerry Thomas's book, London published its first recipe book of American drinks and cocktails, and there would soon be many more in England. So much for the snobby British comments about nothing of value coming from America. Moving on, here's an 1884 cocktail book from Philadelphia, and it's the first time that we see a fun cover. There will be more. And he's sloshing from cup to cup again. You would never guess who published a cocktail book in 1888, the Police Gazette. Notice that it's a woman bartender, as Martha Niblo was, doing that same sloshing maneuver. The Police Gazette would also go on to hold annual bartenders contests for years. Here, once again, the bartender as a showman on the front cover, but these 19th century bartender guides were how-to manuals written by bartenders for bartenders, including bar equipment. That will soon change. Now that we've reached the 1890s, let's take a fun journey to Belle Epoque, Paris, specifically to Montmartre. You recognize these posters and these paintings as the work of the artist Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. But did you know he was an early cocktail aficionado? Lautrec loved food, and to say that he loved to drink is an understatement. But that fondness of drinking did not extend to drinking water. He joked that he disliked the taste of it, and he discouraged his table companions at dinner from drinking water by putting goldfish in the carafes. Lautrec frequented the bars of Montmartre. This painting by Lautrec portrayed himself standing at the bar. He even hollowed out his cane so that he could fill it with liquor. Cocktails appeared in Paris at that time, in the 1890s. The French called them American drinks, boissons américaines. So naturally, Lautrec was keenly interested, as cocktails appealed to his sense of fun, and they were more artistic than wine or absinthe. Now, Lautrec's studio was open to his patrons and dealers every Friday. I mention that because visitors were obliged to follow the house rules of conduct. To properly appreciate a painting, he would say, one must first drink a good American cocktail. He officiated as host and kindly offered everyone a rainbow, one of his specialties, which he had learned from the nearby Café Weber, and then he further developed these artistic layered cocktails. He prepared the drinks in his studio from a portable bar with a zinc top, stocked with the best liquors. Now, we tend to think of a portable cocktail bar as new in the roaring 20s, don't we? But this was a quarter century earlier. Lautrec was a skillful barman, and he delighted in concocting innovative mixtures. For instance, as an initiation ceremony for first-time visitors to the studio, they were offered an earthquake of his own invention, half cognac and half absinthe. And you still find Lautrec's creations in cocktail books today. Now, to put the next story in context, cocktails in America were just for men at that time, either at bars or at gentlemen's leisure clubs. Women were admonished not to drink, and there weren't any cocktail parties back then. In fact, Wikipedia claims that the very first cocktail party was in 1917 in St. Louis. Is that true? Perhaps there was another cocktail party more than 2 decades earlier. So let's return to 1890s Paris. This magazine, La Revue Blanche, was a French art and literary magazine to which Lautrec contributed artwork. He designed this cover. The magazine was founded by the Natanson brothers, and in the winter of 1895, Alexander Natanson asked Lautrec to organize the private viewing of decorative panels that he had commissioned for his house, painted by Edouard Vuillard. As the master of ceremonies for the party, Toulouse-Lautrec took care of every last detail, including this invitation, all in English, illustrated by Lautrec, promising American and other drinks. The largest drawing room in the house was emptied of its furniture and turned into the Bar d'Alexandre, with a long black counter. A notice warned, "Don't speak to the man at the wheel." In other words, the bartender. Lautrec was dressed in a white jacket and a vest made out of an American flag. There isn't an illustration of that. His assistant, Maxime, for an amusing contrast, was 6.5 feet tall. Some 300 guests, the cream of Parisian society, watched the acrobatics of these two, juggling their flasks and shakers. The list of drinks would defy belief. Cocktails, cobblers mixed with champagne, coolers prepared with sweet wines, eggnogs, sparkling iced fizzes, juleps and punches, maraschino and chartreuse, whiskey and various bitters, absinthe, everything Lautrec could think of. The evening began quietly, launched with mild and sparkling drinks, then a series of cocktails, then increasingly robust concoctions, then Lautrec's famous rainbows. Most of the guests had never had a cocktail before and didn't know about the hidden dangers of these sweet and innocent tasting delights. They didn't remain standing for long. The guest of honor was the artist, Vuillard, who had painted the decorative panels, but all he could remember afterward was waking up, fully dressed, shoes still on, in the hostess's bed when she came into her room in the early hours of the morning. Alfred Jarret, the father of surrealism, was among the first to collapse on the sofa, followed by the French anarchist Félix Fénelon. How do we know this? The writer, Jules Renard, sat at a table and surveyed the battlefield. He amused himself by writing down his count of the victims, both men and women, and in what order they fell. Lautrec, for once, had not touched a single drop of alcohol. He performed his duties with devoted seriousness. Later, he boasted of having served more than 2,000 drinks that evening. All right, returning to our cocktail books now. This next year, 1896, saw the publication of this cocktail book by Louis Fouquet with a pretty Art Nouveau cover. Cocktails had arrived in Paris to stay. Now we'll travel to San Francisco, The American Bartender, 1891, by William Boothby. Now, if you're a cool and trendy bartender today, one word on the cover will stand out to you: mixologists. You know, today, the trendy ones don't call themselves bartenders. They're mixologists, and they think that word is new to differentiate them from the past bartenders. No, that word goes back to the 19th century with many books mentioning that. And this variation, Mixologist, from this 1895 Cincinnati cocktail book. Boothby's book was selling well until the San Francisco earthquake hit in 1906, destroying all of the printing plates and all of his inventory. Boothby bounced back and came out with his 1908 edition. Here he calls himself the premier mixologist. Still in San Francisco, here's a 1914 cocktail book. Now, do you remember that 19th century bartenders' guides were written by bartenders for bartenders? So now we see something new. For the man who entertains at home, do it yourself. But do you notice it was still for a man? Cocktails were still a man's world during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. That would soon change in just a few years. Well, you know what happened next, don't you? Exactly 1 century ago this year, Prohibition, the Volstead Act. What the temperance movement didn't understand was human nature, to always want to do what is forbidden. Beyond human nature, I think, is animal nature, don't you? Your cat doesn't want to go through the door that you open for them. They want to go past the closed door, right? So Prohibition actually made drinking alcohol and cocktails more popular. Before the Roaring '20s, cocktails were an amusement for gentlemen of leisure, not something that the everyday person was even aware of, until they were told you couldn't drink. Then everybody wanted to. As Mark Twain said, it is the prohibition that makes anything precious, including for women. Drinking was a part of the flapper way. This wasn't trivial. Women feeling free to drink in public, in mixed company, was a major break from centuries of social restrictions for women. Here the flapper says, "I say, Smithers, have you got an alarm clock?" The butler says, "I have, Miss Joan." She says, "Well, just bring it here and set it to cocktail time, will you?" The 1920s cocktail boom was actually a 2-step process. First was the wish to drink, partially because it was forbidden, but the quality of the spirits was terrible. Bootleggers didn't have time to age whiskey, but gin could be made quickly, and it was cheap. But it tasted awful, so it needed sweet flavors to disguise the taste of gin made in a bathtub. And the speakeasy might be raided at any minute, so cocktails could be drunk quickly. And their innocent taste made you drink more than you should, which is good business for the speakeasy. But mostly, cocktails were fun. The main focus of the Roaring '20s, as you know, was having fun for both men and women. But here, I want to clarify an important point of my talk. Being drunk in itself is not fun. Cocktail parties were all about socializing. Being with people is what's fun. Cocktails might help you relax and enjoy the repartee a little more, but the focus of a cocktail party is on your friends, not on your drink. You already knew that, but I wanted to clarify what I meant by 1920s cocktail culture, wanting to have fun. Next, I'd like to dispel a popular myth. Excuse me. Today, many people think of the Roaring '20s, the Gatsby age, as the age of the cocktail, with a boom in creative new recipes. Well, maybe worldwide it was, but not so much in America. Here, bartenders used existing old recipes and often simplified them to accommodate whatever limited ingredients could be found, and they modified recipes to cover the taste of bad spirits. The best professional bartenders could no longer legally practice their art, and they found a way to move to Europe or Cuba. The ones who remained were mostly younger men who didn't mind dealing with the police raids and maybe with gangsters. So yes, cocktail drinking became more popular here during Prohibition, yes, but the art of the cocktail and the quality suffered. Meanwhile, Paris and Havana, Cuba benefited by an influx of expert American bartenders and American travelers thirsty for a legal drink. England was also a destination for expatriate bartenders. Before Prohibition, Harry Craddock, shown here, was head bartender at New York's Knickerbocker Hotel and at the Hoffman House. He left America at the beginning of Prohibition, joining the American bar at the Savoy Hotel in London in 1820, and he became the head bartender there. And do you remember the photo I showed earlier of Ada Coleman? She was the previous head bartender at the Savoy Hotel, and she's the one who mentored Harry Craddock. Now, Harry wrote the most famous cocktail book of that era, the Savoy Cocktail Book, with a beautiful Art Deco cover. Actually, this cover you're looking at now is the reprinted edition. I'm showing this so you can see the design better. My first edition, which I'm holding here in the small window if you can see me, is not as pristine, but it was printed with metallic silver ink. The Savoy bar itself is Art Deco. This is what it looks like today, or rather the last time I was there a few years ago. The interior of the book is also Art Deco, illustrated by Gilbert Rumbold, who is known for art like this. The recipe pages in the book are illustrated. Airplanes for this spread that contains the recipe for the aviation cocktail. And now, by 1930, all mixed drinks are called cocktails, instead of the original bittered sling definition. Paris was another mecca for cocktails, of course. The famous American jockey, Todd Sloan, opened a bar in Paris in 1911. And for the decor, he dismantled a bar in Manhattan, shipped it over piece by piece, and installed it in his New York bar near the Paris Opera House. To actually run the bar, Todd hired Harry McAlone, who had been a bartender at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. That's Harry out in front of the bar, pointing. When Todd Sloan's lavish lifestyle bankrupted him in 1923, he sold the bar to Harry, becoming Harry's American Bar. Can you read that? Headquarters, IBF, International Barflies, trap number 1. Here is his 1927 cocktail book, Barflies and Cocktails, with the whimsical rules for the international barflies that go on for 5 pages. And the code of the barflies. The final line at the bottom, if you can't read it, is, for a barfly to be bar dry is hell. You can also see on the right side that charter member number 72, there it is, was the novelist Sinclair Lewis, who incidentally died 25 years later from advanced alcoholism. Speaking of which, the original founder of the New York bar, the jockey Todd Sloan, also died from complications of excessive drinking, cirrhosis of the liver, at the young age of 59. I suppose any lecture on cocktails should include some cautionary tales, yes? But to return to the topic of cocktails in Paris, many of today's classic cocktails, like the Bloody Mary, the French 75, Sidecar, the Monkey Gland, were created at Harry's bar. Here we see the Volstead cocktail. Quote, this cocktail was invented at the Harry's New York bar, Paris, in honor of Mr. Andrew J. Volstead, who brought out the Dry Act in USA and was the means of sending to Europe such large numbers of Americans to quench their thirst. But also notice the cocktail above it, which was the winner at a bartender's contest in Vienna. Europe took the art of the cocktail seriously. The 1920s were a very creative time for cocktails, just not so much in America. Harry's New York bar is almost unchanged today, a century later. It's my favorite historic bar in the world. And its bartenders are still being creative, not just historical. Downstairs, at the Ivory's Piano Bar, that's where George Gershwin composed An American in Paris. And when you visit Harry's New York bar, the next time you're in Paris, I recommend the downstairs bar. That mixologist I found is usually more creative. Here's another cocktail book by Harry, this time published in London. Here's an attractive cover designed by the Clarice brothers in Paris. I love their work. They also designed this very large 1926 poster for The Last Waltz that's hanging high in our living room here. Here's a cocktail book from Budapest with what seems to be the devil making the cocktail and a single woman drinking it with a straw. Barcelona, Spain, again with a single woman at a bar holding her straw. This cover is from Madrid, Spain, 1927, and has two women at the bar. Times have changed, especially for women all over the world. Now, back in the US, some Americans had found a legal way to get alcohol. Here it is, a prescription form for medicinal liquor from my collection here. You can see on the top line, it's for whiskey. Yes, medicinal liquor. By the US Treasury Department, no less. It was issued under the authority of the National Prohibition Act. So how did you get one of those? By asking your doctor. The lyrics of this song go this way. Most everybody you meet nowadays seems to be feeling blue. They say it's an imposition to enforce this prohibition, and I think so too. But Congress has given doctors the power to hand out the brandy and rye. And now in their office, at most any hour, you're bound to hear someone cry, oh doctor, don't feel my pulse. That's not what I need for results. Write the prescription and please make it say, take with your meals. I eat 10 times a day. Now, since Americans could no longer legally buy the ingredients to make cocktails at home, you would expect the cocktail books were no longer being written here, right? No, there were plenty for the general public. This was published in 1928 in New York. How did it justify publishing a cocktail book in the States at the height of Prohibition? It posed itself as historical, as served before the war, when mixing drinks was an art. Here's another fun one, recipes for snake bites or something. They can't be for cocktails, can they? It's undated Prohibition era, compiled in order to preserve some evidence of the genius and ancestry of those good old days. We are now up to 1930, back in New York City, shake 'em up. This time, they're no longer making any excuses for publishing a cocktail book during Prohibition. The tone is now more rebellious. This book is all wet, referring to the dry era. It is made for people who fling parties, for people who go to parties, skipping down a bit. In short, for the American people in the 12th year of Volstead, 1930. It has taken the authors 12 years to write this book, 12 years of bathtub gin, synthetic scotch, homemade wine, and needled beer. Needled beer, by the way, is non-alcoholic near beer that has been spiked with moonshine. But now they realize one must go on living, and they go on to give cocktail recipes. The illustrations are by Herb Roth, who is known at that time for his caricatures of famous people. This is from the same year, 1930, still in Prohibition, also in New York City. It's the largest book in my collection. I'm holding it here in the window, if you can see me. It's a songbook about drinking with cocktail recipes. Every song is a drinking song. Okay, here is one of my favorite cocktail books, Bottoms Up. Hey, that's the title of my talk today. It was published in Minneapolis during Prohibition, and it's extremely rare. There are only 2 known surviving copies in the world, one in France somewhere, and my copy here. It's too fun to be hidden away in my fire safe, so I published a reproduction copy 7 years ago, so anyone could read it. With a few extra chapters that I wrote. You can get one on Amazon. The original book was die cut in the shape of a cocktail shaker and is dedicated to the past masters and the present chemists, meaning they were making cocktails during Prohibition and bragging about it. Every page is a favorite recipe of a celebrity, and at the bottom of each page is a famous bar, like the Brown Palace in Denver. Now, the average person couldn't find the illegal ingredients for cocktails, but celebrities, they had their connections. This book was created by the publisher, George Buzza, who clearly loved cocktails. Now, the Buzza Company was one of the nation's largest greeting card companies, with annual sales reaching $70 million in today's money. I mention that because no one knew the stock market was about to crash. But with very fortunate timing, George Buzza sold his company in 1929, just before the crash, and moved to Hollywood. What did he do there? Start another company and publish another celebrity cocktail book during Prohibition, Hollywood Cocktails, with Art Deco artwork, which I think he did himself, and favorite recipes of movie stars like Mae West, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Will Rogers, Jean Harlow. Now this next one is different. Prohibition Punches, entirely non-alcoholic beverages. Notice the Capitol Dome on the cocktail shaker? I'm amused by the drawing of an elegant evening party with everyone dressed up and socializing while holding small glasses of fruit drinks. We're up to 1932 now in London and Valencia, Spain, another beautiful cover in 1933. And that brings us to the last month, finally bringing us to the repeal of Prohibition. Therefore, 1934 saw an explosion of cocktail books, as you would guess. I'll only show a few. This is the smallest book in my collection. I'm holding it here in the window, if you can see. It's from the famous Sloppy Joe's bar in Havana, Cuba, 1934. They weren't for sale, as you can see on the right, but they were given to the regular patrons, like Ernest Hemingway. Speaking of famous people, does anyone recognize this artist? Probably not by his face, but you probably recognize the artwork of John Held Jr. We've already seen a few of his drawings. He created the most famous look of the Roaring Twenties. John Held especially loved cocktails, as you will see. Here's a set of playing cards that I have, dancing and shaking cocktails. His illustrations decorated glass cocktail shakers in 3 different sizes, a hip flask, hip hip. These are the glasses that go with the shakers. And we start to see how much John Held loved cocktails. Here's my favorite Held item in my collection, a cocktail tray with cocktail recipes, which I'm holding up in the small window, if you can see me. And here, John Held is called on to judge the colors of these drinks because he was such an acknowledged authority on cocktails. Now, do you remember my comment about cocktails being popular because they were forbidden? That makes me wonder if maybe a part of Held's own great fondness for cocktails was due to him being brought up Mormon in Salt Lake City, where drinking was forbidden. Held illustrated 4 cocktail books. He knew that cocktail parties were all about having fun. I love his work, don't you? I'm showing the next 2 books together, side by side, both by the same publisher, because there's a very odd difference between the two. 1935, the Merry Mixer on the left, and 1938, just a few years later, on the right. Beside the different color background, what's the main difference between these two? Yeah, the bartender's assistant on the original was a woman, then replaced by a man. Here is the first edition. Hey, that's social distancing. Second edition with a replacement. First edition with 2 women. Second edition, both replaced by men. First edition and second edition. First edition in the lower right corner of the page. He's in black and she's in wedding white. Second edition in the same lower right corner. The other illustrations weren't changed because they were already only men. There isn't a single female in the entire second edition. The changes weren't explained anywhere in the book, so I have no idea. Now, going back to his youth, John Held sold his first illustration in 1898. And like many people, he had a fondness for the time period of his youth. Those were happy days for him. Even though John Held was most famous for his round-headed cartoon style like this, he personally preferred 1890s style woodcuts and those old vintage fashions from his youth that he used to illustrate this 1930 cocktail book published during Prohibition. He enjoyed the slow craft of carefully cutting the wood and linoleum blocks. He used both of his styles here to poke fun at the change from bars as a place for men in the 1890s to a place for flappers in the Roaring 20s. Another favorite item in my collection is this cocktail slide rule, I guess you'd call it, in John Held's woodcut style. If you can see me in the window, I'm holding it up, you can see it's quite large. You pull the tab up to reveal the recipes in the tiny windows. So Catherine was asking me about recipes before we started here. If you really want an unusual recipe for my talk, here's a good one. The Applejack Rabbit, made from applejack, which is brandy distilled from apples, maple syrup, you don't often see that in cocktails, and lemon and orange juice. Just play with the proportions of those 4 ingredients until it tastes right to you. Moving on, the interesting thing about this book is that it shows how far cocktail culture had permeated into small-town America. Cocktails weren't just for New York City. This book was published in Girard, Kansas, a small town, population less than 2,000, far from any city. But as you can see here, they did have a paved street and their own cocktail book. Hey, are you still awake? Do you need to stand up for a 7th inning stretch? How about shifting to a completely different realm of cocktail culture? Tropical drinks are fun. The first tiki boom hit big in the 1950s, as you probably know, but tiki culture actually started rather quietly right after Prohibition was repealed in December 1933, which essentially meant January 1934. That was an important year, 34. Back then, hardly anyone noticed tiki drinks, and here's what happened. Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant was happy to shift from his clandestine speakeasy called Ernie's Place to a legitimate bar. But he quickly found that he needed to stand out from the crowd of new bars that suddenly proliferated around Los Angeles because of the repeal of Prohibition. The way that you did that back then was with a special theme. Ernest chose Polynesian tropical decor, created a series of colorful rum drinks, and called his bar the Beachcomber Cafe in Hollywood in 1934 with his wife Sunny Sund as his business partner. The Beachcomber Cafe wasn't alone. The South Seas in LA was more exotic, with 12 waterfalls, volcanic rock, tropical foliage, and a giant tree. Today, it's Clifton's Cafeteria, which my wife Tracy and I love. Then Ernest changed the name of his place to Don the Beachcomber with these 3 rooms. Victor Bergeron also opened a bar when Prohibition was repealed in Oakland, Hinky Dinks, and he also found that he needed to stand out from the crowd of new bars. He had been fond of tropical motifs from his travels to the South Pacific, and he knew about the new Beachcomber Cafe. So right away, he changed his bar name to Trader Vic's, the same year as the Beachcomber, 1934. Now, to clarify something, these 3 1930s bars did not create tiki culture back then. Tropical was merely one of dozens of special themes that bars had, like Cowboy Wild West or a Parisian cabaret, adopted to stand out from the crowd. Tiki was still under the radar, you might say, lost in the crowd. Then along came America's involvement in World War II. Ernest Gant enlisted in the U.S. Air Corps in 1942, and he turned the management of his bar over to Sonny, who was now his ex-wife after a 1940 divorce, but she knew the business. Sonny was an aspiring entrepreneur, and while Ernest was away, she expanded to several more locations. Meanwhile, in Oakland, Victor Bergeron, Trader Vic, created the Mai Tai in 1944, and he wrote his first cocktail book in 1946. But tiki was still a minor specialty at that time. So then what happened? A confluence of several things. After the war, GIs returned from the Pacific Theater with their exposure to exotic cultures. And there was excitement surrounding Thor Heyerdahl's 1947 Kon-Tiki expedition to the Polynesian Islands. Then James Michener won the 1948 Pulitzer Prize for his Tales of the South Pacific, which was, in turn, the basis for the 1949 musical South Pacific and the movie in the 1950s. Vic, Ernest, and Sonny had the right theme at the right time, and in the 1950s, tiki culture really took off. Ernest legally changed his name to John Beach, and Victor started expanding to a chain of Trader Vic's until there were 25 Trader Vic's around the world. And many other bars joined in the tiki craze. The Pina Colada was created in 1954, accompanied by the Singapore Sling, and the zombie cocktail became a standard in tiki culture. The zombie was so strong that customers were limited to only 2, after Howard Hughes struck and killed a pedestrian after leaving down the Beachcombers. Now, temporarily skipping ahead to today, you are maybe more likely familiar with the tiki revival that began in the late 1990s and is pretty big today. But the revival is very different in a significant way. The tiki revival is retro. It's kitsch. So bad it's good in a fun, silly way. But the original tiki rage, that was new and exciting back then. It was cutting edge, the latest way to be modern and trendy in the 1950s. Here's the actor Robert Stack with Don Beach and Friends. Now, if you don't mind a brief but serious digression into social psychology, the tiki boom was clearly escapism, not only to an imaginary tropical paradise, but also an escape from something. Many of the 16 million Americans who returned from the horrors of war suffered from post-traumatic syndrome that they couldn't really talk about back then, and they couldn't shake off. Not only that, but post-war corporations knew that they had an army of workers who had been trained in boot camp to say, yes, sir, without hesitation. And they used that readiness to work without question or complaint to overwork their employees. My dad was one of those hard workers, and he was a manager. So yes, all of that created a lot of stress. The sedative Miltown for anxiety and tension became ubiquitous in 1950s American life, with over 36 million prescriptions in the US, including my dad. I was talking to my mom about that just this morning. She's 98, almost 99. So many Americans at that time had a reason to escape into a tiki paradise or alcohol for a night. Then cocktails enjoyed another boom of popularity in the 1950s, as you know, the suburban cocktail party culture. As in the 1920s parties, they were about socializing, with the focus being on your friends, not on your drink. But the change in the 1950s cocktails ingredients is worth noting. For those who love innovative mixtures with subtle flavors, the 1950s were not for you. The 50s were one of the low points of cocktails ever. The most popular 50s drink for men was, as you know, the vodka dry martini. Tasteless vodka with the smallest splash of dry vermouth. That's it. Maybe gin. No flavor, but it got you there. Maybe helping numb the stress or the boredom of the gray flannel suit life. The dry martini was further popularized in 1953 by Ian Fleming's James Bond. This was a very manly drink, very strong, pure spirits without any mixers, juice, or sweeteners. Oppositely, women liked the very sweet cocktails, like the grasshopper, pink squirrel, and white Russian. My mom did. We were just talking about that too. Here's a cute book from 1952, A Guide to Pink Elephants, 200 Most Requested Mixed Drinks on Alcohol-Resistant Cards. Then in the 1960s, cocktail parties continued for the parents' generation, but the 60s counterculture youth wanted nothing to do with their parents' values. Therefore, in the 1970s, cocktails were out for the baby boomer generation, and wine was in. But Americans were just beginning to drink wine, and we weren't very sophisticated yet, as you can see. Does anyone remember Boone's Farm apple wine and Strawberry Hill? Sweet white Zinfandel was an easy way to begin drinking wine, or Bartles and James wine coolers. Then cocktails started to return in the late 1980s, as seen in the 1988 film Cocktail with Tom Cruise. Flashy juggling was back, but those cocktails were made with shortcuts, like sour mix made from powder with artificial ingredients. 1980s and 90s cocktails were large and sweet, like the Blue Lagoon, the Fuzzy Navel, the Woo Woo, or their names had sexual innuendo, like Between the Sheets, Sex on the Beach, Slippery Nipple, Screaming Orgasm, and Slow Comfortable Screw Against the Wall. Those were the real names. And then, as a backlash to all of that, a high-quality cocktail revival kicked in this century, with natural and custom-made ingredients and house-made infusions, homemade bitters, and with each mixologist striving to be more creative than the next. Craft cocktail bars, as the movement is called, are booming right now, with 100 new ones opening every year. Now, for a personal note, I don't go to those very often, but there's another cocktail trend today, which I personally like as a historian. Going back 35 years for me, before I became interested in cocktails, I was fascinated by the history of absinthe because of its importance to my favorite Impressionist artists, like Van Gogh and Lautrec. This was decades ago, when almost no one was interested in absinthe during the 1980s, so I was able to find original bottles, many of them still full and sealed from before the 1915 ban. They're on the top shelf. It's that case there behind me. When I felt I had a complete absinthe collection, and when Johnny Depp popularized absinthe in the 1990s, making absinthe ephemera too expensive, historic cocktails that intrigued me for the same reasons. And cocktails are more varied and more creative and artistic, as Lautrec knew, and have a more interesting history, as I hope you're finding out. So I started collecting old cocktail books. Almost no one was interested in historic cocktails back then, so the old books were plentiful in the 1990s. But the problem was that almost half of the ingredients listed in the old books no longer existed 25 years ago. For instance, old gin recipes didn't taste balanced because Old Tom gin, specified in many of those recipes, was different from today's dry gin, and no one made it anymore. Swedish punch, creme de noyau, what are those? Amer Picon, Maraschino, creme de cassis, creme de violette. None of those were available back then. And then Ted Hay wrote this book in 2009, beautifully illustrated, and that helped start a vintage cocktail revival. I also recommend David Wondrick's wonderful history of cocktails, Imbibe. Be sure to get his revised edition. So I'm happy with this vintage cocktail revival, of course, but the downside, I suppose, of so many people now interested in vintage cocktails is that I can no longer afford the Antille cocktail books, the old ones, which used to be cheap because no one wanted them and are now insanely expensive, or more insanely expensive. but hey, at least that one has free shipping. That's okay. I don't need any more books. And the positive side of this greater interest in vintage cocktails is that distillers have one by one revived the old liqueurs. You can now get Old Tom Gin by several distillers and everything else that I mentioned and more. This is the liqueur section of our kitchen here. Finally, we can know what those old cocktails tasted like. The internet is what made this niche interest possible. There are enough customers scattered throughout the world to make this specialty viable, and you can order them online. So that brings my Cocktails Through Time tour up to today. To conclude, you might enjoy a quick visit to a couple of unusual cocktail bars that I visited a year ago, last summer. Now, you would think that any business would want high visibility, right? But both of these bars are completely hidden. The first is the Lavomatic in Paris, just a block from where I stay every year. Lavomatic is French for laundromat, and that's the entrance to the bar. First, you go into the laundromat, and then the door to the bar is straight ahead on the right, dryer number 4. You have to know which of the dryer buttons to push to open it. The cocktail bar is upstairs. The following week, last summer, I visited the mayor of Scaredy Cat Town in London. You're only given the address, 12 Artillery Lane, but no building on Artillery Lane has the name of that bar, and none has the number 12 displayed anywhere. So you have to guess that it's probably this unnumbered Breakfast Club restaurant because it's across the street from number 13. And when I was there with a good friend, we honestly didn't know this. We had to hunt and guess. Inside, there are no signs of a bar, just people eating breakfast, which is served all day and night. So if you want the bar, you go up to the person at the counter and say, just like a speakeasy password, the mayor sent me, which we knew. Then they open the door of that big white refrigerator, which is the door to the bar. You descend down the stairs into the mayor of Scaredy Cat Town. On the walls are paintings of scaredy cats. So I actually think this is smart marketing. These bars are intentionally reminiscent of the old speakeasies in a fun way. And cocktails are all about having fun. And maybe you'll impress a friend that you're cool by knowing this inside information. I think that's part of it. Which brings us to the end of my talk. Tonight, we looked at where cocktails came from and the first American cocktail and the early bartenders, ice harvesting, a visit to Toulouse-Lautrec's cocktail party, Prohibition in the Roaring '20s, creative expatriate bartenders in Europe, some of the more interesting cocktail books, including John Hell's fun cocktail artwork, tiki drinks and the evolution of cocktail culture up to today's craft cocktails and the revival of vintage cocktails. I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you, Richard. We're going to take some questions, and we have one that I'll read for you. But first, I have a question. Your research is amazing, and it must have been incredibly fun. And I'm just curious, the Lautrec invitation that you showed, how did you find that? Is that in an archive somewhere?
I found it in a book about Toulouse-Lautrec, a very large one called Lautrec's Table. It's a beautiful book. I recommend it. Okay.
Well, Leslie asks, I think it means when was Corpse Reviver created? I think
Corpse Reviver. Oh, I don't know all of these, but that is Prohibition era. So it's the 1920s. I think it's Paris, but that's what we have Google for. And I'll bet it's on Wikipedia. I'll bet it has its own page. So I love that today we can always defer to Google.
We'll look that up, and we'll invite people to use the chat for more questions. We'll wait for some more to come in. But while we're waiting, you mentioned to me before we started that the story of vermouth was something that you weren't going to get to tonight, and we won't take too much time tonight, but just give us a little tidbit of that history.
Oh, that is worth mentioning. Okay, thank you. But it's very quick. Vermouth came along as a cocktail ingredient in the 1870s and 80s. And that really made a big difference in smoothing out the harsher flavors. And what happened right then is two cocktails. One was the Manhattan, which is the old cocktail, the original cocktail with vermouth. And as soon as you had that, the Manhattan, that same year, you had a new word for the original cocktail, the old-fashioned, because it was now old-fashioned. And then the Martinez cocktail came along, which was gin at that time. And that was gin and a lot of vermouth, half and half. And some of them had even more vermouth than gin. Another story you had to skip over was vodka was not a cocktail ingredient because that was something that was, we just thought of as foreigners drank, like Russians and Eastern Europeans. And it's something you drank straight until, it's a wonderful story. I wish I had more time, but the Moscow Mule in Los Angeles in the, back in the 50s, 1959, 49, 59, helped popularize 39. Anyways, it helped popularize vodka as a cocktail ingredient. So it's fun to see the ingredients come in one at a time.
Right. Let's see, Patty and Dennis say, are you going to write a book about the history of cocktails? We know about your bottoms up reproduction here with some juicy information in the back, but it just whets our appetite for more, so.
That's funny, well, thank you. Well, in my dance research, some of you know, I mostly look into niches which other people are not covering. And if it's already been covered very well by someone, I let that stand if it doesn't need to be fixed, so to speak. And the same thing in this case. Some very good books on the history of cocktails have been written. I recommend those two I mentioned, Ted Hayes, and then also David Wondrick's. So I don't think another one is needed.
Earl asks, any tidbits on flaming cocktails?
Yeah, be careful. But seriously about that, you might have noticed in that one illustration, the old woodcut of Jerry Thomas sloshing back and forth, that there were flames. That was his famous blue blazer. And I didn't really want to talk him down, but basically he was kind of a braggart. He was loud and boastful, and he claimed cocktails that he created that he didn't really create, like the Tom and Jerry. And his most famous cocktail, the Blue Blazer, was just was whiskey and warm water to heat it up so it could burn. And it tasted awful, but it was flashy. That was the story of Jerry Thomas, basically. He was replaced by the professional bartenders in the next generation. But the caution always is be careful. It looks easy, but you can seriously burn yourself. And that whole idea of flaming absinthe, by the way, is pure myth. It never existed back then. That's Johnny Depp, 1990s. So in case you were thinking about the flaming on the ice sugar cube on absinthe, if that's what you're asking about, that's 1990s and 2000.
I think those are all the questions coming in on the chat and Facebook. Earl said he might unmute everyone and kind of make it a free-for-all, sure. But maybe you can raise your hand and take turns too. So,
well, there aren't that many people here, so we could we can handle just have questions here.
Or if you want to make a comment too, that's fine. Earl is going to invite you to unmute.
Yeah, you can, I've set it up so folks can unmute themselves.
Okay.
If they wish to. Anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
I won't ask the question, but I will say thank you, Richard. This was unbelievably interesting and entertaining. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, definitely. Isn't absinthe poisonous?
Nope, it is not. There are even Scientific American magazine way back in I think 1960s actually analyzed it all. The problem with absinthe was this myth about the green fairy. The artists and poets had a myth that if you, the 3 stages of absinthe drinking, and as you reach the 3rd level, you see the green fairy who is the muse of your inspiration. And drinking beyond the point of getting drunk is serious a problem. That's what kills you, drinking beyond getting drunk. And so that part of it, absolutely dangerous, but it's not a toxin. It's not psychedelic. And here's a funny thing. Did you know that absinthe was actually never illegal in the United States? All along, we thought it was, and then they looked up, and a certain percentage of thujone was illegal. But actually, that number was only reached half the time. So some absinthe all those years was illegal. And I don't know, that's why you see so much absinthe now legal, but because it passes that threshold. And of course, much of Europe and France simply made it legal because it's not poisonous. Sorry, it's not hallucinogenic. Sorry about that. But drinking too much is not good.
Frederick asks, do you have any rare or interesting bar jokes?
I don't. I'm kind of proud that I don't have any bar jokes. So let me turn it over to you. Do you have one?
Is that Frederick Frederick Park? You want to tell a joke?
Oh, is that Fred Park?
Yeah.
Oh, you're here. Oh, hi, Frederick.
Good evening, sir. Thank
He
you.
is a professional storyteller. I'll bet he has one.
Well, you know, since you have permitted me so kindly, most of the bar jokes that I know are singularly wanting on the level of being really interesting. But I'd like to give you all a little something that is like this, enlivening, if I may. During this downtime we are all experiencing, I have been looking for anything and everything that might be a silver lining. You understand? It's so needed. So laughter being the best medicine, of course, perhaps only beside a really good cocktail. I have been reaching out to people dear with whom I have not spoken in years and cleaning up my address book. These conversations are my knee-jerk reaction to our need to connect. Most of them have been long, but they start with a joke. And I reached out to a friend of mine in Ireland, and this is not a bar joke, but it is so singularly delightful. I'd like to ask permission to share it with you.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm in Appalachia. We tell lots of stories here about Jack. This comes from County Cork. And it turns out they tell lots of stories about Hamish. So Hamish got married. After 2 years, he and his wife were having a rocky road. They lived in the country on a farm. She came home one day from the little town down the road and said, Hamish, I met a new woman in the town. She is a marriage counselor, and I think we ought to go visit. So Hamish said, well, we've been having a tough time ironing things out by ourselves, so let's go. Well, the marriage counselor met him and said, I'll see both of you together, but I want to see you both independently. And they agreed. So on the day that Hamish went by himself, after his visit with the marriage counselor, when he came home, he walked through the barnyard and out to the barn, and he took off all his clothes, and he put on a little tiny bathing suit, and he tucked flowers in his hair and tied ribbons to his arms, and he walked out in the barnyard and started dancing a jig around his old tractor. When his old friend comes driving down the road and stops at Hamish's gate and says, Hamish, what has gotten into you? So he told it just like I'm telling you and said, I just got back from the marriage counselor. And his friend said, well, and said, Hamish, what has gotten into you? So he told it just like I'm telling you and said, I just got back from the marriage counselor. And his friend said, well,
and said, Hamish, what has gotten into you?
For some reason, there was a huge echo. And
Yes, we lost you.
am I there now?
Yes, is the story almost through?
The final line is, Hamish said back to him, the marriage counselor told me to go home, dress up, and act sexy to attract her.
Ah, funny.
Well, thank you
That
for
is good.
that story. And we have one final very nice joke here that says, absinthe makes the heart grow fonder. So with that, I think we'll all say farewell and thank you very much to Richard. And on behalf of the Bar Harbor Historical Society, thank you to everyone for listening to our very first virtual program. If you're in the neighborhood in Bar Harbor, please stop by or please write us a message on Facebook or through our website. Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
Good night.
Carolyn, thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Richard.
thank you.
Carolyn.
Thank you, Bar
This
Harbor.
was great.
Thanks,
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 Richard.
Richard.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.